I saw myself as unbreakable, tender as stone. At first, I merely believed this until one day it became the truth. Then I was able to tell myself, without lying, that it didn't affect me, that he didn't affect me, because nothing affected me. I didn't understand how morbidly right I was, how I had hollowed myself out. For all my obsessing over the consequences of that night, I had misunderstood the vital truth that it's not affecting me. That was its effect. Trauma limits response flexibility. A flashback to our chapter's tragic opening scene, only this time set in a parallel universe where my trauma imprints don't rule the day. The plane lands and Ray's text pops up on the screen. That's not what I expected, I say to myself. But I get it. She's probably immersed in her painting. Nothing new there, nor anything personal. Actually, I can empathize. How many times have I gotten so absorbed in work that the clock got away from me? Okay, taxi it is. I might as well notice some disappointed feelings, in which case I allow myself to feel them until they pass. In effect, I choose vulnerability over victimhood. Arriving home, there is no upset, no emotional detaching, no sulking, maybe some gentle teasing, but all within the bounds of loving humor and with affinity intact. I would have thus exhibited what is called response flexibility, the ability to choose how we address life's inevitable ups and downs, its disappointments, triumphs, and challenges. Human freedom involves our capacity to pause between stimulus and response, and, in that pause, to choose the one response toward which we wish to throw our weight, wrote the psychologist Rollo May. Trauma robs us of that freedom. Response flexibility is a function of the midfrontal portion of our cerebral cortex. No infant is born with any such capacity. Baby's behavior is governed by instinct and reflex, not conscious selection. The freedom to choose develops as the brain develops. The more severe and the earlier the trauma, the less opportunity response flexibility has to become encoded in the appropriate brain circuits, and the faster it becomes disabled. One becomes stuck in predictable, automatic defensive reactions, especially to stressful stimuli. Emotionally and cognitively, our range of movement becomes well nigh sclerotic, and the greater the trauma, the more stringent the constraints. The past hijacks and co opts the present again and again. Trauma fosters a shame based view of the self. One of the saddest letters I've ever received was from a Seattle man who had read my book on addiction, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, in which I showed that addiction is an outcome, not the only one possible, but a prevalent one, of childhood trauma. 9 years sober, he was still struggling, had not worked for a decade, and was being treated for obsessive compulsive disorder, also called OCD. Although he found the book fascinating, he wrote, "I resist the opportunity to blame my mother. I'm a piece of shit because of me." I could only sigh. Self-assaulting shame so easily moonlights as personal responsibility. Moreover, he had missed the point. There's nothing in my book that blamed parents or advocated doing so. In fact, I explain over several pages why parent blaming is inappropriate inaccurate, and unscientific. This man's impulse to protect his mother was not a defense against anything I had said or implied, but against his own unacknowledged anger. Stored away in deep freeze and finding no healthy outlet, the emotion had turned against him in the form of self-hatred. Contained in the experience of shame, writes the psychologist Gershon Kaufman, is a piercing awareness of ourselves as fundamentally deficient in some vital way as a human being. People bearing trauma's scars almost uniformly develop a shame-based view of themselves at the core, a negative self-perception most of them are all too conscious of. Among the most poisonous consequences of shame is the loss of compassion for oneself. The more severe the trauma, the more total that loss. The negative view of self may not always penetrate conscious awareness and may even masquerade as its opposite, high self-regard. Some people encase themselves in an armored coat of grandiosity and denial of any shortcomings so as not to feel that enervating shame. That self-puffery is as sure a manifestation of self-loathing as is abject self-depreciation, albeit a much more normalized one. It is a marker of our culture's insanity that certain individuals who flee from shame into a shameless narcissism may even achieve great social, economic, and political status and success. Our culture grinds many of the most traumatized into the mud, but may also, depending on class background, economic resources, race, and other variables, raise a few to the highest positions of power. The most common form of shame assumes in this culture is the belief that I am not enough. The writer Elizabeth Wurtzel, who died of breast cancer at age 52 in 2020, suffered depression from an early age. Her childhood was traumatic, beginning with a secret deliberately kept from her about who her actual father was. I was intensely downcast, she chronicled in an autobiographical piece for the New York Magazine, with a chronic depression that I began when I was about 10. But instead of killing my will, it motivated me. I thought if I could be good enough at whatever task, great or small, that was before me, I might have a few minutes of happiness. That conviction of one's inadequacy has fueled a great many glittering careers and instigated many instances of illness, often both in the same individual. So I want to stop for a second here and note that those of us that are most addicted and depressed and downtrodden shares such a intense similarity to those of us who are the highest achievers, and that it seems like it's such a toss of the coin between depression and narcissism. And maybe we'll learn more about that on the way through this. I also wanted to note how childhood trauma led this woman to intense depression, which led her to workaholism and cancer. After all, this book is about the mind-body connection and how trauma leads to many chronic illnesses. So I'm sure there will be more on that as we go along. Right, this will be the last section that I read for tonight. It's called Trauma Distorts Our View of the World. Everything has mind in the lead, has mind in the forefront, is made by the mind. Thus opens, I'm going to mess up this word. Thus opens the Dhammapada, the Buddha's timeless collection of sayings. Put another way, the world we believe in becomes the world we live in. If I see the world as a hostile place where only winners thrive, I may well become aggressive, selfish, and grandiose to survive in such a melee. Later in life, I will gravitate to competitive environments and endeavors that can only confirm that view and reinforce its validity. Our beliefs are not only self-fulfilling, they are world-building. That makes a lot of sense. Here's what the Buddha left out, if I may be so bold. Before the mind can create the world creates our minds. Trauma, especially severe trauma, imposes a worldview tinged with pain, fear, and suspicion, a lens that both distorts and determines our view of how things are. Or it may, through the sheer force of denial, engender a naivety, rosy perspective that blinds us to real and present dangers, a veneer concealing fears we dare not acknowledge. One may also come to dismiss painful realities by habitually lying to oneself and others. Okay, that was really short. I'll keep going. Trauma alienates us from the present. I once shared a meal in an Oslo restaurant with the German psychologist Franz Rupert. The noise was overwhelming, loud pop music pumping through several speakers and multiple TV channels blaring from bright screens mounted high on the walls. I have to think that when the great Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen used to hold court in that same establishment a little over a century before, the ambience was much more serene. "What's this all about?" I shouted to my companion over the cacophony, shaking my head in exasperation. "Trauma," he replied as he shrugged his shoulders. Rupert meant simply that people were desperately seeking an escape from themselves. If trauma entails a disconnection from the self, then it makes sense to say that we are being collectively flooded with influences that both exploit and reinforce trauma. Work pressures, multitasking, social media, news updates, multiplicities of entertainment sources. These all induce us to become lost in thoughts, frantic activities, gadgets, meaningless conversations. We're caught up in pursuits of all kinds that draw us on, not because they are necessary or inspiring or uplifting, or because they enrich or add meaning to our lives, but simply because they obliterate the present. In an absurd twist, we save up to buy the latest time-saving devices, the better to kill time. Isn't that the truth? Awareness of the moment has become something to fear. Late-stage capitalism is expert in catering to this sense of persistent moment dread. In fact, much of its success depends on the chasm between us and the present, our greatest gift, getting ever wider. The false products and artificial distractions of consumer culture designed to fill in the gap. What is lost is well described by the Polish-born writer Eva Hoffman as nothing more or less than the experience of experience itself. And what is that? Perhaps something like the capacity to enter into the textures or sensations of the moment, to relax enough so as to give oneself over to the rhythms of an episode or a personal encounter, to follow the thread of feeling or thought without knowing where it leads, or to pause long enough for reflection or contemplation. Ultimately, what we are distracted from is living. I'm going to end it there. Gives us all a lot to think about.